This week on the Mindful Men podcast.
Guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rinnie, and today I'm getting mindful about the positive impact that we can have by sharing our stories. Stories have become a pretty integral part of my life. As a therapist, over the last couple of years, I hear a lot of stories around mental health and disability, parenting, addiction, suicide, you name it, I've probably heard of it. But this also extends into my life as a podcaster. So, as the host of a podcast, I have guests come on and share their stories. I mean, I started this podcast by sharing my own story, but also as a guest as well, I jump on a whole bunch of other different podcasts and share my story and have discussions around mental health or parenting or fatherhood, relationships, you name it, we talk about it all. And I absolutely love it. I've really come to enjoy sharing stories and talking about different stories from different perspectives. I put on my mental health hat or my parenting hat or my social work hat. I mean, I've got a hat on today, the Mindful Men hat, and it's just such a therapeutic process for me. It's not something that I've done forever, just the last couple of years, but I find it so useful and I really enjoy it. And I want to do more of it, and I'm going to keep doing more of it. And sharing stories, I know, is not an easy thing for a lot of people, though. And I think back to when I first started sharing my story. This is way back in 2012 when I finally found that courage to see my GP and say, I think I've got a mental health condition. Can you help me? It was a really difficult thing to do, and I'd been putting it off for a couple of years. And I didn't know what to expect, but I felt relief after that first conversation, and then the referral to a psychologist, and then going to share my story with them. And from there, actually finding out that I've got these diagnoses of OCD, depression, anxiety, etc. And again, finding more relief. Now, at the time, I expected a magical wand response and for me to share my story and to be healed instantly by whatever a psychologist would tell me or the medications that my GP would put me on. Didn't happen. But over the coming years, I found that the more and more I shared my story, the easier and easier things became. It became easier for me to see when I was down, or easier for me to see what things worked and what things didn't work. But largely, I kept these things quiet. I kept them internal, outside of my wife and my GP and my therapist. And then 2020 came along and my burnout story. And you would have heard me talk about my burnout story a few times. In fact, there's an episode dedicated to that on this show right back at the start. And I know there's a few people listening to those early episodes. So it's great to have you on board listening to those early episodes. And in 2020, it was a real pivotal moment in my life where I felt like I need to share my story broader than my wife, broader than my GP, and broader than my therapist. And so I started sharing it in my workplace. In fact, burnout was really important for me to talk about in my workplace because burnout was such a real issue where I worked. But that's where Mindful Men, the Instagram page, was born. And I started sharing my story there and then on Facebook, LinkedIn. I created a LinkedIn profile. And then this podcast, the Mindful Men podcast, came along as well, where I was able to project that story even further to people from all over the world. I think since this show has been on the airways, we're in over 20 or 30 countries around the world, which is just amazing. This story or my story or even the stories of the guests that I've had on have been heard in 20 or 30 countries around the world. That's just phenomenal. And thinking about the podcast, we've had over 100 episodes with something like 70 or 80 guests that I've recorded, having discussions with, hearing their stories, sharing my story. I've had a lot of solo episodes sharing my story or my insights into different things. In terms of me being a guest, I've been on over 60 or 70 podcasts. Again, sharing stories, talking, having conversations with people from all over the world. And I've also been a speaker at numerous events, mainly here on the Sunshine Coast, but also in Brisbane as well. I've got a big one coming up this year at the International Mental Health Conference. So I'm really excited to get on a bigger stage and talk to more people about the Mindful Men journey and my story and so forth. And I'm not sure if you can hear, but I'm actually getting excited sharing my story about stories. So it has an effect on us that is enlivening, it's empowering. Or at least I find that's the case. Because for so long, I kept my story hidden and I felt like I was living a double life. But by sharing my story, I feel like I have so much more energy and I want to share it more. I want more people to hear it. But even though I do this a lot, I do talk a lot, I share my story, I get asked to share my story at different events that I come to or with different people, or I have even just phone conversations with people interested about mindful men's therapy business, and I have a bit of a story tell there as well. There's a lot of time that we feel like we're not being heard. And I reflect on it. Sometimes I've been in different therapy spaces where I've had different therapists and I've shared my story, but I didn't feel like the therapist was really connecting in with that story. Or there's been times in my previous employment life where I've shared a little bit of my story, maybe with a manager or a colleague, and it's been dismissed. And this is really dejecting. And I can understand why so many people kind of stay away from sharing their stories because they might have had similar experiences. What I've come to learn over the years is that if that happens, maybe just that person's not the right person to share my story with. And this is also an interesting, I guess, issue or concept for podcasters. And I know there's podcasts listen to this podcast because that's what we do. We listen to each other's podcast and we put a lot of effort into creating this content for the world. So to give you a bit of insight into podcasting, I thought I'd share a bit about what's involved. And it goes from essentially creating the platform and thinking about what kind of content you want to produce. And for me, that was around mental health and men's mindfulness and all the stories that are involved with that. So it was very easy for me to find ideas for content. Then it goes about actually creating the content, maybe writing scripts or blogs or creating posts like thumbnails, static posts, videos, audiograms, all sorts of things. If you have guests on, it's about finding guests and scheduling guests and then, navigating the guest host experience as well. And then you actually come down to recording an episode. So you've done all this work before the episode and then you record the episode, which can go anywhere between half an hour to an hour. I've had hour and a half episodes sometimes even longer as well. So recording that and hoping there's no technical issues or anything like that along the way. Then after that, if you're doing it on your own, you're editing and then you're publishing. And that in itself is hours and hours and hours of work. I'm fortunate today that I've got an editor for me. So Sam, hello, if you're listening. And also I had Ricky Lee as well previously, who was helping me out with some editing as well. But I know for many podcasters, you don't have an editor or anything like that. So you are doing it all alone. And so podcasting, for example, as a way of sharing stories is tiring work. There's a lot into it. And independent podcasts, such as the Mindful Men podcast, such as many of the ones that I've been on as well, really do have to work hard to get listeners to hear the stories. And for some, they put a bit of money towards marketing, but others really rely on natural growth or organic growth and rely on guests sharing the stories with their audiences and relying on our own social media to grow or our email list to grow so that we can share these stories too. So it is a hard slog as a podcaster, as someone who shares stories, as someone who facilitates other people to share their stories too. And so on that, I do want to thank each and every one of you for dialing in and listening to this episode. And maybe you've been along for a little while, or maybe you've been along for the whole journey. And I really do love it. I love seeing the subscribers go up on my analytics. I love seeing comments and DMs and all that. It's just absolutely fantastic. And that's what keeps me going in the podcast world. And that's a really important note as well, is that majority of podcasts don't actually get past 10 episodes. In fact, many don't get past 3. And so for us to be over 100 episodes is just a phenomenal feat. And I've been reflecting on this recently because I was also a guest on the Mindful Midlife Crisis with Billy Lahr, and I also had Billy come on this show as well to share his story. So we kind of collabed on sharing both of our stories each. And he recently retired his podcast for very similar reasons, knowing that how hard it is to go week in, week out, sharing stories. And as an independent podcast, maybe not hearing as much feedback as possible, or maybe not realizing the amount of downloads or subscribers that we thought that would happen as we started sharing our stories. And sometimes I get into this negative mindset too. I start to wonder, why am I doing this? Why am I sharing this story? Why am I sharing the stories of other people? Why am I going through hours and hours of work and thousands of dollars a year to create a podcast? And this is the question that many podcasters ask themselves. How can we do it better? How can we get the growth? How can we get the downloads? How can we get the subscribers? How can we monetize a podcast so that it doesn't actually cost us money? I've had this conversation with many of podcasters in the last couple of years, and it is a real thing that we think about. And it's also something I guess I think about in other aspects of my business as well, around the therapy business or creating a new program or two. How can I do this the best so that it makes money, doesn't cost me money, because money is important, but also how can it impact the most people around the world? It's a constant dilemma. And this is the dilemma of sharing stories or wanting to share stories broader than our initial social groups that we're in. And so recently, I've also been feeling a little bit down, as I mentioned, around the podcasting space, going, why am I doing this? What's the reason? Is there any benefit to doing this? And sometimes I even thought about giving it up. And it's a question that my wife often asks, is like, why do you keep doing this? Or other people keep asking me, why do you keep investing time and money and effort and energy into this thing? But then I always come back to some basic principles as to why I keep doing it. And the first was to share my story. That was really important, and it still is important. Every time I record an episode or host a guest or even be a guest on somebody else's podcast, I just get a lot of energy for it. I find this therapeutic. And in fact, as I grow my business, I want to become more of a keynote speaker as well. So I use podcasts to practice speaking to an audience. And that audience is you out there. It's an audience with people from around the world, from different walks of life, all interested in learning about mindfulness and learning about men's mental health or men's health or fatherhood or whatever topic we're discussing this week. But then I also think about the impact that these stories that I share are having on other people. And podcasting is a place that can be very quiet. You don't usually hear a lot of feedback from the listeners out there, from you out there. Sometimes it can be very quiet. In fact, often it is very quiet. And sometimes you feel like that mic is not going to anybody else out there but an empty room. But on saying that, I do know you're out there because I see the listens that I get every single week. But then this last couple of weeks, I had a couple of conversations that really lit me up and made me realize that, yes, my message is getting out there. For example, I had a client who came into therapy and we were having a chat about something, and then he started sharing about some insights that he had from a recent episode that I recorded. And I looked at him and I didn't even know he listened to the podcast. And I'm like, man, first of all, thanks for sharing your insights. Second of all, thanks for listening. It was an amazing thing to think and feel and have that experience with a client that I work one-to-one with in the therapy space. But it didn't stop there. I was at a business location and talking to the provider, and then the provider said, oh, Simon, I heard this particular episode that you did on this topic, and I shared it with another provider just because I think that some of the content that you have would be really beneficial for them and their clients. So what this is a ripple effect. I created a splash by sharing a story on the podcast, which this provider heard, and then they threw the stone a little bit further down the pond, and now it's creating a ripple effect in another part of Australia, which is really exciting for me. And thirdly, I was in my clinic space and I was talking to a fellow social work colleague. I won't mention who they are because I'm not sure if they want everyone to know that they listen to the Mindful Men podcast, but hopefully it's not that much embarrassing. We were talking about one of the topics on the podcast around drinking alcohol and the impacts of alcohol, and me sharing my sobriety story. And they started sharing how they listen to it when they go on long drives. And I'm like, wow, I didn't even know you listened to the podcast. So thanks so much for tuning in, and keep it up. Share it around if you get some value for it. So these three conversations really lit me up and made me realize that, yes, sharing our stories do matter and they can have a positive impact on other people. From the client that I spoke with, sharing me their insights, from the provider sending it on to another provider for their client's benefits, but also a fellow social work colleague, a peer, a friend who listened to it and was getting some valuable insights or thought-provoking questions for themselves, some critical self-reflection on their long drives to their client and their caseloads as well. So it highlighted, as I said, the value of sharing our stories. And particularly in the podcast space, for any podcasters listening, you might be feeling pretty dejected, like I mentioned before. But knowing that your stories do matter, at one point in time, someone who needs to hear your story will hear that because it's going to be out there in the world. And it may not be for them, but maybe they'll share it with somebody who desperately needs that story. And that's a fantastic thing. That's why we do podcasting, to share stories, to inspire people. That's why I do Mindful Men, to inspire men particularly, but people in general, to pause, to reflect on their lives, to grow mindfully, to switch off the autopilot and start living conscious lives. So what's the point of this story? I think I've rambled on for a little bit, but the point of the story is sharing stories matter. Your story matters. Now, whether or not that's in the podcast space, whether or not it's content creation, there's a lot of stuff on social media. Maybe it's you realizing that maybe you need to start sharing your story with your GP or a therapist, because if you don't, your mental health will get the better of you. Maybe it's you wanting to share your story with your boss at work because you're overworked, you're stressed, you're about to hit burnout, and you want to stop that before it gets to burnout. So maybe this is going to prompt you to have that conversation with your manager. There used to be a TV ad back in, I think it was the 80s, 90s, noughties, about going to the Northern Territory in Australia, and it had Daryl Summers from Hey Hey It's Saturday there, and he would often say, you never know if you never go. I feel the same with sharing our stories. You're never going to know what someone's going to say to your story if you don't share your story in the first place. That was really important for me in my mental health journey, and it continues to be important for me in my mental health journey. But now as a therapist, it's really important for me to hear stories of guys that come into my clinic, often for the first time, and hear them out, to see their vulnerability, to provide support, to provide silence, and to guide them on their way in whatever wellness looks like for them. And so that's pretty much it for today's episode. I wanted to highlight that sharing your story is important. And in fact, it's therapeutic as well. It's good for the world. It's inspiring for others. And it's easier the more you do it. I do this a lot. I do podcasts a lot. I'm the host of this Mindful Men podcast. I'm a guest on other podcasts. The more we speak, the easier it gets. It's as simple as that. Now, one thing before I let you go is help me blow the Mindful Men podcast up and get it into more eyes, ears, and hearts around the world. The easiest way for you to do that is wherever you're listening to this right now is to, at the end of this episode, go into the Mindful Men podcast and find where it says rate this podcast. Give it a 5-star rating. And if you can do a review as well, that's perfect. So Apple Podcasts, for example, you can do a rating and review. Spotify, which is one of the other major platforms that this podcast is on, you can only do the 5-star rating. So the more people that we can get to rate the podcast, and that's all you out there, the more we can get it to climb the rankings and the ladders. And once we start to get up the ladder and into the top 200 and the top 100, the top 10, etc., then thousands, if not millions of people can see the podcast, hear these stories. Hey, and maybe if you've been a guest on the show, they'll hear your story. Or maybe you want to be a guest on this show and share your story. So the more we can get it up the rankings, maybe your story can go to millions of people around the world. And if you're on YouTube, it's easy to subscribe to the channel as well. It's not so much rankings, but it's subscribers on YouTube. And if you want to support the show as well, I've got a Patreon link in my link tree, which you can go and donate $5 a month or whatever you can afford to keep the show on the airways. This podcast costs me money to run, and I'm happy to pay for it. But if we can get some financial investment in the show, then it just makes the podcast cost neutral. If you don't want to do a Patreon thing, maybe think about sponsoring an episode. It's not going to be expensive, and you get lifetime sponsorship for your brand or product or business or an event that you've got coming up. Reach out to me and we'll talk about different ways that you can sponsor the show. Well, that's it for me today. Just a bit of getting mindful about the positive impact that our stories can have on the lives of others. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the show and on the episode or any of the other episodes as well. Shoot me a DM on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook. I'd love to connect with you there. Also, don't forget to jump into the Mindful Men community page in Facebook. It's a free community for men to come together to learn about mindfulness, to connect with each other, and just keep each other accountable, keep each other going, keep each other happy as well, sharing content with each other, creating a sense of community. Well, that's it for me today. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are in the world. Until next time, stay mindful.